The desert wind carries the sound of marching feet. Dust rises in perfect rhythm, step for step, shield for shield, spear for spear. 10,000 men move as one, their lines unbroken, their discipline unshaken. Cloaked in shining armor, their ranks stretch farther than the eye can follow. To their enemies, they were not an army. They were a wall of flesh and iron. The Greeks called them the Immortals, not because they could not die, but because it seemed they never did. Whenever a soldier fell, another instantly took his place. The ranks never thinned, the line never wavered. 10,000 strong, always, eternal, unyielding. They were the guardians of Persia's kings, the most elite soldiers of the Achaemenid Empire, the mightiest empire of its age. From the palaces of Persepolis to the battlefields of Thermopylae, they stood as the king's living shield, feared and respected in equal measure. But who were these men, really? What made them more than ordinary soldiers? Was it their training, their discipline, their loyalty, or the illusion of invincibility that struck fear into the hearts of their enemies? This is not the story of gods or myths. This is the story of men, chosen, armed, and drilled into perfection, who became the iron backbone of one of history's greatest empires. And so, as their sandals strike the earth in unison, a question lingers in the air. What made the Immortals immortal? Long before the Immortals marched across battlefields, there rose an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. In the 6th century BCE, Cyrus the Great carved out the Achaemenid Empire, a realm from the Indus to the Aegean, Persia's mountains to Egypt's deserts. No empire had ever spanned so far, uniting dozens of nations, languages, and cultures beneath one banner. But such greatness demanded protection. For an empire built on both conquest and tolerance, the king was more than a ruler. He was the axis upon which the world seemed to turn. His safety, his authority, his very presence had to be preserved at any cost. And so, from this need, the most feared and disciplined unit of the Persian army was born, the Immortals. Unlike ordinary soldiers, the Immortals were carefully selected. They were drawn from the heart of Persia itself, recruited for loyalty, strength, and skill. To serve among them was the highest honor. They were not mercenaries chasing wealth. They were the chosen shield of the King of Kings. Their reputation began not with myth, but with discipline. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote that they numbered exactly 10,000. If a soldier fell in battle, he was instantly replaced, making the unit appear eternal. Hence the name the Greeks gave them, Immortals. To friend and foe alike, their strength seemed endless, their lines unbreakable. But it was not only their numbers that made them legendary, it was their role. The Immortals were more than warriors. They were guardians of the empire's heart. They protected the royal court, escorted the great king, and formed the core of Persia's mightiest armies. In times of peace, they stood resplendent in fine robes, carrying golden spears tipped with silver. In times of war, they were the iron wall that advanced without fear, shields interlocked, arrows darkening the skies above them. From the palaces of Persepolis to the passes of Thermopylae, the sight of the Immortals was enough to inspire awe among allies and dread among enemies. They were not just soldiers. They were the living symbol of Persia's eternity. The empire had given birth to its protectors. Now, the world would learn their name. The Immortals were not simply an army. They were an institution. To be counted among their ranks was the highest honor a Persian could achieve, a position reserved for the most loyal, the most disciplined, and the most skilled of warriors. Every soldier was chosen with care. The Immortals were drawn from the very heart of Persia, true sons of the empire, men whose loyalty to the King of Kings could never be questioned. Unlike mercenaries who fought for gold, these men fought for duty, for honor, and for the glory of Persia itself. Herodotus tells us that they were always exactly 10,000 strong. Whenever a man was killed, wounded, or too old to serve, he was immediately replaced. To outsiders, this gave the impression of a force that could never be diminished, a wall of warriors that seemed eternal. And so, the Greeks gave them their legendary name, Athanatoi, the Immortals. But numbers alone did not make them elite. Their strength lay in their discipline. Unlike the ragged militias of other lands, the Immortals were professional soldiers. They trained constantly, drilled in formations, and marched with precision. They could fight in close combat with spears, rain arrows from a distance, or form an unbreakable line of defense. Their armor, though lighter than that of Greek hoplites, gave them greater mobility. They wore scale coats, wicker shields, and carried spears tipped with iron or silver. Practical kit met pageantry, robes of fine cloth, spears weighted with silver or gold. On the battlefield, they were not just soldiers, they were symbols of imperial power. Life among the Immortals was marked by both privilege and sacrifice. They were paid well, supplied abundantly, and treated with respect across the empire. Wherever they marched, wagons of food, supplies, and luxuries followed, ensuring they were always ready for war. But the privilege came with burden. Each man lived under the weight of expectation, that his failure would not only shame himself, but break the chain of eternity the Immortals represented. To fall in battle was honorable. To falter in discipline was unthinkable. They were not nameless soldiers. They were the chosen, the 10,000 who stood at the very heart of the Achaemenid war machine. To the Persians, they embodied eternal strength. To their enemies, they appeared endless. And so, the legend grew, that the Immortals were not mere men, but a force that could never die. When the Immortals marched, it was not like the movement of men. It was like the movement of a single living force. Herodotus described their columns stretching for miles, shields and spears glinting like waves of steel under the Persian sun. They moved with a discipline few armies in the ancient world could match. To their enemies, it was as though the earth itself trembled beneath their boots. Each man carried his own bow, spear, and short sword, but the Immortals were more than just individuals. Their true power lay in their unity. They advanced in tight formations, shields interlocking, spears projecting outward in an unbroken wall. Behind them stood ranks of archers, loosing volleys in perfect rhythm. Unlike the heavily armored Greek hoplites, the Immortals favored mobility. Their armor was lighter, their weapons versatile. This allowed them to adapt quickly, breaking from formation to chase fleeing enemies, or reforming into defensive walls when threatened. But war is not only about weapons, it is about fear. The Immortals understood this. Their presence alone was designed to unnerve. Each man was dressed not only for battle, but for spectacle. They wore robes and armor adorned with rich colors and shining metals. Their spears gleamed with silver or gold. They looked like Persia on the march. Their organization was precise. They were divided into regiments of 1,000, each commanded by officers who reported directly to the king's generals. Orders flowed quickly, movements were coordinated, and discipline was absolute. And always, at their core, was the illusion of eternity. Whenever a soldier fell, another immediately took his place. To their enemies, the line of Immortals never thinned. Behind them followed engineers, supply trains, and servants ensuring that food, weapons, and reinforcements were always at hand. Unlike other armies that starved or broke down during long campaigns, the Immortals marched fully provisioned, always strong. To see them advance was to see the embodiment of empire itself: order, wealth, power, and inevitability. They were the Immortals, 10,000 men moving as one. The Immortals were not only the striking fist of Persia's armies, they were also the shield that guarded its heart. Wherever the King of Kings went, the Immortals followed. In the vast palaces of Persepolis and Susa, they stood as silent sentinels, row after row of soldiers in ceremonial robes, spears gleaming with silver and gold. To see the King of Persia was to also see the Immortals, for their image was inseparable from his majesty. Their dual role set them apart from ordinary soldiers. By day, they could march in perfect formation on the battlefield, and by night, they could stand watch over the royal chambers. They were warriors and guardians, an army and a bodyguard. Their loyalty was not to generals or governors, it was to the throne itself. At festivals and royal audiences, the Immortals flanked the king's throne, spears raised in perfect symmetry. Their uniforms, often embroidered with gold, were as much symbols of authority as they were tools of war. But their duty was more than ceremony. In times of crisis, it was the Immortals who acted as the king's final safeguard. If a rebellion sparked in a distant satrapy, the Immortals were sent to crush it. If an assassination plot loomed, it was the Immortals who shielded the monarch. They were the guarantee that no dagger, foreign or domestic, could reach the throne. Their closeness to power also gave them influence. To serve among the Immortals was not only a military honor, but a political privilege. Many officers came from noble families, gaining access to the inner circle of the empire. And yet, their burden was heavy. To fail in their duty was to fail the king. In Persia, the king was the chosen of Ahura Mazda, entrusted with divine authority. Guarding him was duty and devotion. This is why, even in moments of defeat, their presence inspired awe. When they marched beside Xerxes into Greece, their image was one of order amidst chaos, proof that the empire's heart was still beating. The Immortals were not just soldiers, they were the living throne room of Persia. The Immortals were not created merely for show. They were forged to fight, and on the battlefield, their presence was as striking as it was terrifying. Clad in scale armor, and armed with long spears, short swords, and powerful bows, they marched in disciplined ranks. Unlike ordinary soldiers, the Immortals were trained to switch seamlessly between ranged and close combat, loosing waves of arrows before advancing with spear and shield. But it was not just their weapons that made them fearsome. It was their reputation. Behind the front lines marched an elite force that never broke, never faltered. Onlookers saw only an unbroken wall, like a tide rolling forward. At their peak, the Immortals were the hammer of Persia's empire. They crushed rebellions, secured borders, and led the way in expansion under Cyrus the Great and Darius Thur. Their most famous appearance came at Thermopylae in 480 BC. At the narrow pass, Leonidas's Spartans and Greek allies held their ground against Persia's vast host. Xerxes unleashed the Immortals. Their arrows darkened the sky, their spears pressed forward. But the terrain was against them. The Greeks, heavily armored and shoulder to shoulder, withstood the assault. The Immortals, lighter armored, struggled in close combat. For the first time, the illusion of invincibility cracked. The Immortals were elite, but not gods. They suffered losses they could not disguise. Yet their discipline held, pressing wave after wave until treachery revealed a hidden path and allowed Persia to outflank the defenders. Though Persia won the field, the legend of Thermopylae endured. The Greeks had shown that even the Immortals could bleed. Still, they fought on at Plataea, at Salamis, and on countless other frontiers. But each battle revealed the same truth. Their strength lay not in brute force, but in discipline and fear. Against equally disciplined foes, their edge was less certain. Over time, the weight of empire wore them down. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the Immortals remained a symbol, but their aura of invincibility had dimmed. And yet, their name survived. They were a myth in motion, both glorious and fragile, and like all myths, their fall would be as telling as their rise. For nearly 2 centuries, the Immortals stood as the iron heart of Persia's empire. But no army, no matter how disciplined, can remain invincible forever. By the 4th century BC, the Achaemenid Empire was no longer the unstoppable giant it once had been. Corruption weakened its administration. Satraps grew restless. Kings rose and fell quickly, each more isolated than the last. And with every crack in the empire's foundation, the strength of the Immortals weakened too. Their decline was not due to a single battle, but to slow erosion. Their numbers still stood at 10,000, but their discipline had faded. Some drifted from warriors to courtiers. The Immortals were still feared, but less for combat edge, more for memory. And then came Alexander of Macedon. In 334 BC, the young king crossed into Asia with a hardened army. His phalanxes, drilled and armed with sarissas, clashed with Persia's forces at Issus and Gaugamela. This time, the legend failed. Macedonian formations held. Against Alexander's tactics, even the Immortals faltered. They fought bravely, but not with the invincibility their name promised. The eternal line cracked. Persia crumbled. When Darius III fell, so too did the Immortals. Their core lingered in name, but the glory was gone. And yet their story did not die. Greek histories, Persian memory, and soldiers' whispers kept it alive. The Immortals had been born as a symbol of eternal power. They fell as all men fall, with time, weakness, and defeat. But their name, immortal, remained. Though the empire of Cyrus and Darius crumbled beneath Alexander the Great, the memory of the Immortals outlived Persia. Their legend endured not just as soldiers of flesh and blood, but as symbols of what power, discipline, and unity could achieve. The Greeks, who once faced them in terror, wrote of them in awe. Herodotus described them as immortals, not because they could not be slain, but because their numbers never seemed to dwindle. To the Greeks, this was terrifying, an enemy who could not be diminished. But to the Persians, the Immortals were more than soldiers. They were the bodyguard of kings, the guardians of empire, the embodiment of order. Wherever the great king went, the Immortals followed, spears tipped with silver and gold, armor gleaming. Even after their defeat, the concept of the Immortals survived. Later Persian dynasties revived their name. In modern times, Immortals still sparks fascination, in books, films, and even military units. What made them endure was not weapons or armor. It was the idea they represented. To enemies, they showed Persia was vast and eternal. To Persians, they proved loyalty and unity could elevate ordinary men into legends. Their story carries a warning. Discipline made them strong. Complacency unmade them. No army, however powerful, escapes time. Even the Immortals, despite their name, were mortal. And yet, their legacy endures. They symbolize not only Persia's might, but also its cultural grandeur. For the empire they defended was not only one of conquest, but also one that allowed diverse peoples, languages, and faiths to coexist under one banner. Today, when we speak of the Immortals, we recall the ambition of a people who dreamed of building an empire that could stand against time. Empires fall, legends travel farther, because some names never die.